My name is Margaret Rowland. I'm 67 years old. Most people call me Maggie. I've lived long enough to know that humiliation rarely arrives with warning. It slips in quietly, like morning light under a closed door. That Tuesday began like any other. The kettle whistled. My porch smelled faintly of salt and magnolia, and the Charleston air had that mild chill that only pretends to be winter. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, the paper folded beside me, and opened my phone out of habit. The first post on my screen stopped me cold. It was my daughter, Laura, standing in front of a towering Christmas tree in Aspen. Snow dusted her hair. Her fiancé Blake had his arm around her, and his parents flanked them, all in matching red scarves. The caption read, "Can't wait to spend the holidays with my real family." The word real burned through the screen. 2 days earlier, I had wired to the $900 so she and Blake could take that very trip. She'd sounded so grateful on the phone, Mom. "You're saving us." "Really?" "Thank you." I'd believed her. I read the caption again, slower this time, as if repetition might change it. The coffee cooled in my hand. My first instinct was to call, to demand an explanation, but anger felt too small for the moment. Instead, I opened the comments and typed 12 words, "Your real family won't be paying for your trip." Then I set the phone down and finished my coffee. 10 minutes later, the post was gone, deleted, as if those words had never existed, but they had. I took a screenshot and saved it in a folder labeled simply December. Then I folded the dish rag, turned off the kettle, and stood by the window for a long time, watching a pair of gulls cut across the gray sky over the harbor. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the clock's steady tick, measuring out the first moments of a new distance between us. By the time the church bells struck 9, I knew I wouldn't be hearing from my daughter that day. Chapter 2. Ghosts of Politeness. The rest of the morning passed in silence. No call, no apology, just the soft rhythm of the washing machine in the next room and the low creak of the house settling into another quiet day. I moved through the kitchen like someone walking inside an old photograph, careful not to disturb what was already fading. On the laundry table lay a sweatshirt Laura had left behind years ago, pale blue with the name of her college cracked across the front. I folded it neatly, smoothing the sleeves, the fabric still faintly scented with the detergent she used back then. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice echoing from the hallway, asking if I'd seen her keys, rushing to catch a ride, promising to call. She'd kept those promises at first short calls on Sunday evenings. Quick updates about work, about Blake, about how busy life had become. Then the messages grew shorter, the calls less frequent. Holidays turned into texted photos from airports or dinners I wasn't invited to. Everything became polite, efficient, trimmed of feeling. I remembered something she once said after her first visit to Blake's family home in Asheville. "They make everything feel so put together." She'd told me, her voice full of admiration. At the time, I'd smiled, proud she was loved by people who seemed kind. But now that line came back like a thread unraveling put together. That was what she wanted to be: seamless, effortless, untouched by the rough edges of where she came from. I stacked the folded laundry in the basket, turned off the machine, and stood alone in the hum of my own home, wondering when the warmth between us had cooled into something that looked like civility but felt like distance. The next morning, I woke before dawn, long before the church bells or the gulls. The air in the house was cold, untouched, like it hadn't decided to welcome the day yet. I made tea instead of coffee, this time strong, plain, and carried the mug to my desk in the corner of the dining room, where the old laptop waited. The glow of the screen filled the room as I typed in the password I hadn't used in months, the joint account Laura and I had opened for her wedding expenses. She'd wanted something transparent. She'd said, a way for us both to track progress. Back then, I'd thought it was a gesture of maturity. The balance looked lower than I remembered. I scrolled through the statements slowly, line by line, letting the accountant in me wake up. The one who had spent 40 years chasing misplaced decimals and forgotten ledgers. The first charge was a hotel deposit in Aspen Lodge at White Pines. Then came vendor meeting, charged at a restaurant that served tasting menus and imported wine. Next, a pair of event coordination payments routed to a wellness spa. Nothing about it spelled wedding. A few more scrolls down. One transaction caught my eye. Venmo transfer refund from Mom's wedding gift fund. Blake Cartwell. The date was a week before the Aspen trip. A refund. To him, I stared at the screen until the numbers started to blur, until the glow turned harsh against my eyes. I had taught Laura how to balance her first checkbook when she was 16. She'd laughed when I'd made her write every expense in pen. You're too serious. Mom, maybe I was. Maybe seriousness was the only thing that kept me from falling apart now. I opened a blank spreadsheet and began to type. Merchant names, amounts, dates, categories. My hands moved on their own steady. Practiced, detached. When I was done, I printed every page, 3 copies each, and slid them into a manila folder. By the time the printer went quiet, the sun had reached the window, brushing the glass with thin light. I placed the folder beside my cup of cold tea and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't anger I felt then. It was clarity, sharp, heavy, and absolute. Chapter 4, The Call to Grace and a Lawyer. By noon, the folder sat on the kitchen table beside my untouched lunch. I'd been staring at it for nearly an hour, the way you stare at something that's already changed your life. The evidence was plain. What I didn't know was what to do with it. Old habits saved me. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Helen Ross. We'd worked together back when I handled forensic bookkeeping for the courts, and she managed estate audits. Helen had always been calm, methodical, and mercifully immune to panic. Maggie, she said after 2 rings, her voice warm but alert. It's been a long time. I've got a situation. I told her. It's personal, and it involves numbers. An hour later, we sat across from each other in her quiet office downtown. Her walls were lined with framed degrees and faintly yellowed case files. The air scented with old paper and lemon polish. I laid out the folder between us. Helen opened it, adjusted her glasses, and began reading silently. When she looked up, her tone was steady, factual. You've documented everything well. These, she tapped the highlighted pages, would legally qualify as misappropriated funds. Some can be reclassified. Others are conditional gifts, meaning, if the conditions aren't met, you can reclaim them. I exhaled slowly. The words reclaim and conditional sinking in like a lifeline I hadn't known to ask for. Helen leaned back in her chair. My advice, freeze the account quietly. Don't warn them. You're not punishing. You're protecting your assets and, frankly, your dignity. I nodded, but didn't speak. My heart ached at the thought of my own daughter seeing me as an adversary, a line item to negotiate around. Helen's expression softened. Maggie, sometimes love means setting boundaries so clear they can't be rewritten. The sentence lingered as I signed the authorization form. The sound of my pen against paper felt final, yet not cruel, more like the closing of a door that had been left open too long. Laura stopped by 2 evenings later, suitcase in her car and a new kind of distance in her smile. She said she only had an hour before driving to Asheville. I'd cooked her favorite chicken casserole and green beans with butter, though I wasn't sure why. Habit. Maybe. She talked easily at first. Her words tumbling over themselves about ski passes, Blake's parents, and the magical snow she'd always dreamed of. I listened, nodded, passed the rolls. It almost felt like before until I mentioned the account. I looked over the wedding fund last night, I said lightly. Some of the transactions didn't seem tied to the ceremony. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Then she gave a small laugh, too bright, too careful. Oh, Mom, don't be dramatic. Everyone helps a little. We'll balance it all out later. Something in her tone, the smooth confidence. The easy dismissal didn't sound like my daughter. It sounded like Blake's mother, with her lacquered calm and way of turning judgment into charm. I set my napkin down and reached for my water glass, keeping my voice steady. I'm sure you will, I said. Just make sure you keep receipts. Laura smiled, the polite kind that ends a conversation. She said she had to get on the road before dark. I walked her to the door, helped her with her coat, and kissed her cheek out of reflex. Her perfume lingered after she left something expensive and cold, a scent that didn't belong in this house. When the headlights disappeared down the street, I stood by the doorway for a while, hand resting on the frame. The casserole cooled on the table, untouched on her plate. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. The house was dark except for the low amber light from the lamp above my desk. Midnight had already passed. But sleep wasn't coming. The casserole from dinner still sat in the sink, untouched. The smell of time fading into something faint and sour. I sat down, opened the folder again, and spread everything across the table: receipts, statements, Venmo screenshots, and printouts of emails I'd forwarded to myself months ago without really knowing why. Each piece of paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried a little more truth than I was ready to hold. The forensic part of me, the woman who once traced missing corporate funds down to the penny, took over. I organized by date, category, and recipient. The patterns sharpened under my hands: the trip, the spa, the dinners labeled vendor meetings, a steady pulse of misuse hiding in plain sight. Halfway through sorting, I opened a folder marked wedding correspondence in my old inbox. That's when I found it, an email forwarded from Laura's account, dated 4 weeks earlier. The subject line was cheerful. Just checking in. It was from Cynthia Cartwell, Blake's mother. Her words were smooth, practiced, soaked in polite superiority. Don't worry, darling. Once the wedding's official, you won't have to depend on her anymore. We'll take care of everything. I read it twice, then again, slower. There was no venom in the words, just the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where someone stands and how easily they can be replaced. My hand didn't shake this time. The hurt had already burned itself clean. I printed the message and slipped it on top of the others, aligning the edges neatly before sliding everything back into the folder. Then I reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, the old fountain pen gliding without hesitation. Dear Laura, please join me and my attorney, Helen Ross, on Thursday afternoon to finalize the wedding funds and trust documentation. This will ensure everything is properly managed before your marriage. I look forward to seeing you both there. I read it once, twice, every word polite, every tone controlled. It wasn't anger, it was arithmetic. Balance restored. By the time I sealed the envelope and placed it on the counter for mailing, the clock had struck 1. The night outside was perfectly still. Somewhere between the rustle of papers and the scratch of my pen, pain had given way to precision. Helen's office sat on the 3rd floor of a quiet building off Broad Street, where sunlight spilled through tall windows onto polished oak floors. The place had always smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish, the scent of order. I arrived early, as I always did, and sat across from Helen while she arranged the files in careful stacks. The air was calm, precise, and so was she. They'll come expecting to sign a release for the remaining funds, Helen said, sliding a single sheet toward me for review. We'll go through everything line by line. Let the documentation speak. I nodded, My voice didn't seem necessary anymore. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened. Laura walked in first. Bright smile, neat coat, perfume that belonged to another world. Blake followed close behind, all confidence and charm, the sort of man who shook hands too firmly. "Mom," Laura said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. "This is so nice of you. Thank you for meeting us." Before I could respond, Helen rose smoothly from her chair. "Thank you both for coming. Let's get started." Today's agenda is a review of all financial disclosures and transfer records tied to the wedding fund. Laura blinked. Blake's polite expression faltered. "I'm sorry," he said, half laughing. "I thought this was just for final signatures." Helen's tone didn't shift. "It is, but we'll begin by reconciling the transactions." She opened the folder and spread out the color-coded statements across the table. Yellow highlights, red annotations, crisp corners. The sound of paper sliding against wood filled the silence. "This," Helen said, tapping one receipt, "was filed as a vendor expense but traces back to the Aspen Lodge charged during your vacation. Here, another for a wellness spa, labeled coordination fee. And this Venmo transfer marked as refund from Mom's wedding gift fund to Mr. Cartwell." Laura's breath caught. Blake leaned back, arms crossed, his jaw tightening. Helen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "As of this morning, the account is temporarily frozen pending review. Further disbursements will require written approval." Laura's head turned toward me, eyes wide, face pale. "Mom, what is this?" I met her gaze steadily. Accountability. For a moment, no one spoke. The light shifted across the table, catching the edge of the printed email from Blake's mother, the line about not depending on me anymore. Helen didn't read it aloud. She didn't have to. The words sat between us, heavier than accusation. Blake cleared his throat. "This feels unnecessary." Helen looked up from her papers. Financial clarity rarely is until it's too late. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my pulse even. Years of bookkeeping had taught me that truth didn't need volume. It just needed proof. By the time Helen slid the amended trust document across the table, Laura's voice was barely above a whisper. "You actually changed it." "Yes," Helen replied gently, effective immediately. Laura looked at me again. But it wasn't anger in her face anymore, it was something closer to disbelief. The realization that silence doesn't always mean surrender. 3 days after the meeting, the ripples began to show. Blake's parents sent a brief, carefully worded email to Helen's office, copied to me. They were reevaluating the timing of the wedding and suggested postponing the event until circumstances align more favorably. No apology. No explanation, just distance wrapped in politeness. Laura didn't call. She didn't text. The next morning, I noticed her social media had gone dark. The engagement photos vanished. The countdown posts disappeared. And the last caption about Aspen was gone, as if it had never existed. Her world, so curated and bright, had gone silent. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't even feel angry. I simply went outside and tended the garden. The soil was cold beneath my gloves, rich and forgiving. I pulled a few weeds, trimmed the rosemary, and let the quiet settle into my bones. That night, I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours, the first full night in months. The air inside the house felt different when I woke. Lighter, somehow. No tension humming under the surface. No need to brace for the next slight or silence. The dining table still held the same vase of wilted chrysanthemums from last week, but they looked softer in the morning light. I carried them out to the compost, washed the vase, and filled it again this time with fresh camellias from the yard. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt honest. The rain had been steady all afternoon, a soft, unending rhythm against the porch roof. I was reading by the window when I heard the knock, 3 uncertain taps, followed by silence. When I opened the door, Laura stood there, soaked to the bone. Her eyes red and raw. They dropped me. She said before I could speak, "Blake's parents. They said I should have known better than to bring trouble into the family." Her voice broke on the last word. She looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the practiced ease she used to wear like armor. I stepped aside. She came in quietly, leaving wet footprints across the rug. I didn't reach for her, but I went to the stove and poured her a cup of tea. She wrapped both hands around it like something fragile. "I thought love meant loyalty," she whispered. Staring into the steam, I just didn't realize who deserved it. I sat across from her, the space between us filled with the scent of rain and chamomile. "Now you do," I said. She nodded, eyes down, and for the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a beginning. Weeks passed quietly. The air softened as winter eased its grip on Charleston, and the camellias outside the porch bloomed in pale pink clusters. Laura began stopping by on Sunday afternoons, never announced. Never long, just enough to fold laundry, water the plants, or help me bring in groceries. We spoke gently, like people testing a language they'd once known fluently, but hadn't used in years. There was no grand apology, no sudden closeness, but there were smaller things. She'd stay for dinner without glancing at her phone, ask how I was sleeping, bring a candle or a jar of honey she thought I might like. It wasn't much, yet it felt solid, something built from truth rather than habit. One afternoon, she mentioned applying for work again, her voice steadier this time. I saw the faintest trace of the girl I'd raised, the one who believed effort mattered more than appearances. When she left, she squeezed my hand before stepping off the porch. It was the first touch that didn't carry guilt. That evening, I sat by the window with my tea. The light outside dimmed until only the porch lamp glowed against the dark. I reached over and switched it on, not as a beacon waiting for someone to return, but as a sign of the life still here, warm and steady. "Boundaries aren't walls," I whispered to the quiet house. "They're doors you choose who to open for." The light stayed on, soft and certain, filling the room with something that felt a lot like peace.